Hey up, I do. You've probably heard of Pavlov, right? This is when you say, oh yeah, he rings a bell, and it's hilarious. So what if I told you he never actually rang a bell? In fact, the guy wasn't even a psychologist, and he definitely was not looking into what would then be known as classical conditioning, or anything of the sort. Like most good things, like penicillin and tea bags, the entire thing came about completely by chance. Born in 1849 in Western Russia, Ivan Pavlov studied chemistry and physiology at the Imperial Medical Academy at St. Petersburg, where he graduated and got his MD. He went on to become a very, very skilled surgeon, primarily interested in the cardiovascular system and digestion. And it's at this point I need to mention that ethical standards back then were not... They just weren't. They just weren't. If the whole thing was as clean as we're generally told, then I wouldn't be here telling the actual story. So just bear in mind that this was not an experiment that involved ringing a bell and then giving dogs food. And as I said, Pavlov was a very skilled surgeon, so what I'm trying to say is, while the dogs did need to be alive in order to study digestion, various surgeries were performed. It was not humane. It would be entirely unethical today, and it's not pleasant to think about. We don't need to go into the details of that here, as that aspect really isn't relevant to the classical conditioning bit. I just don't want anyone to get blindsided if you were to then go and look this up yourself and come face to face with things that are not exactly comfortable. So you have been warned. Basically, all you need to know is Pavlov was actually studying the way food is digested when he started to notice that when his lab assistants, in their typical white science lab coats, would go into where the dogs were to feed them, they'd start salivating before they were even given the food. The dogs would start salivating, I should clarify. And Pavlov noticed this and found it interesting and started experimenting a bit. First of all, with a metronome. He started... You're not ringing a metronome, are you? What are you doing with a metronome? You're setting it. You're turning it on. He made a sound with the metronome when the dogs were about to be fed. And sure enough, in time, they started to salivate after hearing the sound of the metronome before actually seeing or smelling the food. So how this works is you have an unconditioned stimulus, an unconditioned response, a conditioned stimulus, and a conditioned response. The unconditioned stimulus is a thing that naturally triggers a thing in response. In this case, it's food. When a dog sees food, they salivate. Nobody has to make that happen, it just happens. The salivating is the unconditioned response. The unconditioned stimulus causes the unconditioned response. Then you want to introduce a neutral stimulus. A dog wouldn't usually salivate just when hearing a metronome. I mean, they're pretty cool, but they're not exactly tasty. Then you introduce the neutral stimulus, the metronome, and the unconditioned stimulus, the food, at the same time. So you make the sound, you do whatever it is you do to the metronome, you get the thing of the metronome, and you like turn it, and then you let it go, and it does the tick, tick, tick thing that a metronome does, right? There has to be a word for that. You make a sound with the metronome, at the same time you present the dog with the food. And in time, the dog learns to associate the metronome with receiving food, and they salivate. And now you have a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response. The conditioned stimulus being the metronome, and the conditioned response being salivating at the metronome, instead of just the food. Which is exactly what happened accidentally in the first place. Dogs really shouldn't be salivating at some human lab coat. Ideally, that's not a thing that should cause that kind of response. Hence the lab assistants being the neutral stimulus, over time becoming the conditioned stimulus. He also, for what it's worth, used a tuning fork, a whistle, flashing lights, and minor electric shocks, because again, no ethics here. But what he didn't do was ring a bell. Basically, did everything but ringing a bell. So there you go. Now you know what Pavlov didn't do. And I can say it was totally worth getting that psychology degree, because look, I'm using it now. It wasn't a waste of time. I'm using it, look at me. Do I lose credibility by doing this as a VTuber? All energetically with my accent of all things? Maybe. But you're not meant to judge books by their cover, except you absolutely should. That's what a book cover is for. That's a very strange saying when you think about it. Anyway, if you're still here, it'd be really great if you could like, comment, subscribe, ring a bell, and you'll have done something that Pavlov didn't. Share the link, put your left foot in, your left foot out, push a pineapple, shake a tree, hold a chicken in the air, stick a deck shot up your nose, write I'm a fish 400 times to do a fun little dance and faint. I'd be very grateful. I don't ask for much. Civvy. Dogs really shouldn't be Why can't I say salivating?